Can a totalitarian regime cause a famine? Or for that matter, can racism be the cause of a famine? The answer is a measured yes. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about some of the deadliest famines in the 20th century and the circumstances and the reasons behind their occurrences. So we start with the deadliest famine of them all. That was the China Famine from 1958 to 1962. Yes, 4 full years the people of China underwent a huge famine. And what was the cause? The origin can be traced to Mao Zedong's decision to launch the Great Leap Forward. Yes, mass mobilization of the country's population, which he thought would achieve in just a few years the economic advances that took many other nations decades to accomplish. So Mao was very impressed with Stalin's push for industrialization of the Soviet Union, so he too stressed the key role of heavy industry and made steel the centerpiece of his effort. So Mao expected the industrial infrastructure for China to be built not via expertise, but via numbers. So peasants were forced to abandon private food production in favor of the newly formed agricultural communes, which were supposed to do mass plantation of grain so that the production overall would increase, and the freed up peasants would be focusing their efforts on steel production. And how is he intending to produce steel? Have these peasants mine for local deposits of iron ore and limestone and build simple clay furnaces to smelt the metal. Yes, that was his model for competing with the Soviet Union, United States, and other European countries with respect to steel. But in reality, what came out was lumps of brittle cast iron, unfit for even simple tools. So while the peasants are focusing on producing this brittle iron ore, on the agricultural side, fabricated reports of record grain harvests start getting issued to demonstrate the superiority of communal farming that Mao has started. Yes, Mao was cooking his books when it came to the agricultural produce from China. In other words, he was committing economic fraud. So the local officials sent grossly exaggerated reports of their success, proclaiming harvests 3 to 4 times their true size. Now the overall demand for food was still the same, and based on these numbers, China decided to export total grain by a factor of 2, from 1.9 million to 4.1 million tons. So your production has actually decreased. Your numbers have been fudged to show a 2 to 3 times of the actual output. So based on those numbers, you decide to double your exports. Essentially, you've taken all the food that was meant to be consumed by the local population and exported it. And the aim of the exports was to import industrial equipment to promote the Great Leap Forward. So the people are starving and dying of starvation. And what is the government doing? Suppressing the information. Yes, local officials got busy suppressing information about people starving to death, so much so that they started confiscating even letters at the post office that were trying to spread information about the famine. Through this period, about 36 million died from starvation. Yes, to put things in context, about 11 million were killed during the Holocaust. Yes, thrice the number of people killed during the Holocaust. And that is the prime reason why I consider Mao Zedong the most brutal dictator in history. And his culture of governmental cover-up ensured that news about the famine stayed under the wraps all the way through the 1980s. And it was only when the first reliable population census was published in 1982 that the true extent of the deaths between 1959 and 1961 could be determined. While the China famine was essentially man-made, the 1921-22 Soviet Union famine was a combination of drought, economic, and political factors. Now, during the course of World War I, close towards its end, Russia underwent the Bolshevik uprising, which led to Vladimir Lenin becoming the new leader. But things didn't stop there. World War I continued for about a year longer, and Vladimir Lenin's government itself faced opposition, which led to a civil war across the country. And this meant that the Red Army had to be stocked with weapons and food, which in turn meant that all grain had to be confiscated for the purpose of the military. The Volga River Basin, essentially the southeastern part of Russia, was its primary grain producing and exporting region. But from late 1920 onwards, it had faced unprecedented heat and dryness, so essentially it was leading towards a drought. But ever since the Bolshevik regime had come to power from 4 years prior, there had been a gradual shift or reduction in the land under cultivation, mainly because of the policies of the new Vladimir Lenin government, which had requisitioned supplies from the peasantry for little or nothing in exchange. And this had led peasants to drastically reduce their crop production. And the rich peasants were withholding their surplus grain to sell on the black market. Ultimately, the lack of food became so severe that it was recognized that the seed grain would be eaten rather than sown. Contrary to what Mao Zedong did in China, the Russian authorities and the Bolshevik government realized that there was a famine. Though late, yet Vladimir Lenin and Russian writer Maxim Gorky appealed in an open letter to all honest European and American people to help Russia during this famine. And who came to Russia's aid? Of course, the United States. America had formed the American Relief Administration, or the ARA, under Herbert Hoover, who would later on become the 31st President of the United States. And the aim of the ARA was to help countries that were starving post-World War I. Lenin had earlier refused offer for assistance from the ARA, citing it as an interference in Russian internal affairs. But as the situation became more dire, he relented and opened up to assistance from the ARA. Hoover was strongly anti-Bolsheviks, and he was even asked why he was coming to their assistance. And he responded with, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. Yes, looking back at history, it was America that came to the aid of Russia at the time. Author Maxim Gorky himself told Hoover that his help would long remain in the memory of millions of Russians whom he had saved from death. However, not all Russians could be saved, and in the end, the death toll of this famine was 6 million people across the Soviet Union. The famine had an economic and a political fallout, and that essentially was Lenin turning slightly capitalist. Yes, you heard it right. Lenin announced his new economic policy, which would include a free market and capitalism side by side with state control. And this concept was known as mixed economy, where the state continued to control banks, foreign trade, and large industries, but allowed private individuals to own small enterprises. He also abolished the concept of grain requisition and instead went towards a tax on farmers. So the new economic policy stayed into effect through the time of his death in 1924. The Bengal famine of 1943 was the result of imbalance in supply and demand, World War II, and a very deep racist policy of one individual. In late 1943, which was thought to be the peak of the famine, the rain levels were actually above average, so there was no concern with respect to soil fertility or produce. It was essentially caused by policy failure instead of any monsoon failure. So what were the various policy failures? One of them seems to be World War II and the fall of Burma to Japan. So Burma, now Myanmar, which was a major supplier of rice in that region, fell into enemy hands. But since the Japanese had almost reached next door, British India, anticipating a Japanese invasion via the eastern border of Bengal, launched a preemptive, two-pronged scorched earth initiative in eastern and coastal Bengal. The goal was to deny the expected invaders access to any food supplies, transport, and other resources. First, a denial of rice policy was carried out in 3 southern districts along the coast of the Bay of Bengal. These were expected to have surpluses of rice, and John Herbert, who was the governor of Bengal, issued an urgent directive in March of 1942, immediately requiring stocks of paddy, that is unmilled rice, deemed surplus, and other food items to be removed or destroyed in these districts. The second prong was a boat denial policy, which was designed to deny any Bengali transport to any invading Japanese army. So it applied to districts readily accessible via the Bay of Bengal and the larger rivers that flow through it. And this was implemented in May. After an initial registration period, the policy authorized the army to confiscate, relocate, or destroy any boats large enough to carry more than 10 people. So about 45,000 rural boats were confiscated, and this led to severe disruption in riverborne movement for labor, supplies, and food, and ended up compromising the livelihoods of all the boatmen and the fishermen. Essentially, transport was unavailable to carry seed and equipment to distant fields or rice to the market hubs. And the government made no effort to compensate these people who had lost their livelihood because of the boats being confiscated. Now, as the food situation worsened and the government was able to see the impact on the people, beginning as early as December 1942, very high-ranking government officials, including John Herbert, the Bengal governor, Viceroy Linlithgow, Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, and other officials began requesting food imports for India through government and military channels. But these requests were either rejected or reduced to a fraction of the original amount by Winston Churchill's war cabinet. However, by the first half of 1943, the situation had really worsened, and you could virtually see corpses lying on the streets of Calcutta. And this time, there was a different excuse offered by the war cabinet, and that was the upcoming Allied plans to invade Normandy. Viscount Archibald Wavell replaced Linlithgow as the new viceroy in the second half of 1943, and he too began a series of demands to the war cabinet for large quantities of grain. And when his requests were again denied, he described the crisis as one of the greatest disasters that had befallen any people under British rule, and the damage to the British reputation, both among Indians and foreigners in India, was incalculable. By now, Churchill was blaming the famine on Indians, who, he said, were breeding like rabbits. And then he asked subsequently, if the situation was so bad, how come Gandhi was still alive? In the end, 3 million people died because of this famine, and it had a lasting socio-economic impact across Bengal. Because of extreme scarcity of food, a total of 260,000 families sold all their land holdings outright, thus moving from the status of landholders to that of laborers. And it is expected those who engaged in rural trade, fishing, transport, suffered the most. And agricultural laborers faced the highest rates of destitution and mortality. And this policy in Bengal was one of the triggers for the Quit India movement launched in 1942 by Gandhi. 1991 was a pivotal year in the post-World War II era. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, marking an end to the Cold War and the independence of several satellite countries which were earlier part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. While many countries rejoiced, the collapse of the Soviet Union ended up being a catastrophic event for a country that had been solely reliant on the Soviet Union for economic and financial support. Its neighbor, North Korea. In episode 2, we talked about when Korean Peninsula got split between North and South. The North had access to most of the heavy industry, whereas the South was more agricultural. And the reason for that was the soil in the South being fertile and very conducive to agriculture as compared to the North, which was cold, mountainous, and had a lack of high quality farmland. But in the 1980s, the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung embarked on a policy of self-sufficiency known as Juche. So farmers were expected to overcome Mother Nature and grow enough crops to feed the entire population, and to do so, they relied on tons of chemical fertilizer. Now, the chemical fertilizer industry in North Korea was heavily reliant on cheap fuel from the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire North Korean economy was thrown into chaos, and agriculture was the biggest casualty. And as the farm yields plummeted, the government started a new campaign urging citizens to consume less. The new slogan, "Let's eat only 2 meals a day." The situation totally got out of hand in 1995 and 96 when the El Nino weather pattern brought widespread flooding to North Korea. And as a result, 15% of the country's already scant arable land was completely destroyed. And at this point, the North Korean government appealed to the United Nations Food Program for humanitarian aid, blaming the floods for the disaster. Yes, even Kim Jong-il had the sense to ask for aid, as opposed to Mao Zedong, who preferred to keep the famine under the wraps. But unfortunately, the end result was the same. Without enough food to go around, the military was identified as the number one priority to be fed. So the government cut rations for farmers, slashing the portion of their harvest that they could keep for their own families. And as expected, farmers began hiding their grain to make sure that their families did not go hungry. In 1996, the World Food Program found that half the country's corn crop had gone missing. From there, the situation continued to worsen, and even though food aid continued to flow in, much of it was stolen by well-connected elites who then resold at marked up prices, and farmers started doing the same with their own crops. So as a result, food prices soared and the poorest continued to starve. Though the numbers are not very reliable, but the common estimate is about 1 million to 3 million casualties out of this famine. 3 million out of a population of 22 million. About 14% of the population perished because of the famine. So there's almost a pattern we see in these catastrophic famines. Presence of a totalitarian regime. And why? Because of lack of accountability. Late reaction, not accountable to the people, and the ability to get away even after mass casualties as high as 36 million in China. And with that thought, we conclude this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Did Princess Anastasia survive the execution of her father, Tsar Nicholas II, and the rest of her family post the Bolshevik uprising in Russia? Post the collapse of the Soviet Union, an investigation in 1991 identified 9 bodies as belonging to the Anastasia family members and servants, but Anastasia and her brother's bodies still appear to be missing. And in 2007, a DNA analysis of another grave discovered near the first conclusively identified Anastasia and her brother Alexei's bodies. So the answer is no. Princess Anastasia did not survive the assassination of her father and the rest of her family. On to the question for this episode. Which are the top 3 food producing countries in the world? By food meaning agricultural products. Is it A, China, India and the US? B, China, Russia and Brazil? C, the US, China and Germany? Or D, the US, China and Russia? Once again, which are the top 3 food producing countries in the world? A, China, India and the US? B, China, Russia and Brazil? C, US, China and Germany? Or D, US, China and Russia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in this episode. In the next episode, we take a deeper look into the most important military asset of the 20th century, the atomic bomb. We'll take a look at the initiation, the conception, the development, implementation, and the arms race that it triggered across the globe. If there are any other topics you would like to hear about, do leave me a note or a message via the contact page on my website, ajaykaul.com, ajaykaul.com. So I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.